Do you think that you know what queer means? Is it an insult to you? Does it just mean LGBT? Is there some deeper political meaning? Well, no matter what you think, somebody thinks you're wrong. As a homo guy, I've noticed the word queer over the past few years becoming synonymous with somebody who is both LGBT and also a feminist. This is how I remember it happening. Once upon a time in the 90s, I did queer activism. Back then, we were trying to reclaim the term as an umbrella word for LGBT people, and it was supposed to be a way to unify us. Most of the people I knew were lesbians, so the feminist vibe was always there, but we were more united by not being heterosexual than by being feminists. I don't think I ever really officially identified as a feminist, though I might have said so if somebody asked if I believed in equality or whatever. At the time, I don't even really remember a whole lot of man-hating, so it didn't bother me, even though I knew the man-hating was probably there. During the 2000s, lots changed in LGBT culture, and I had moved cities and found relatively different friend groups. I don't really remember all that many people identifying as queer for a few years, but after a while I do remember personally getting fed up with hanging around straight people because homophobia became pretty acceptable in the mainstream during the Bush administration. Because Bush made a big deal out of trying to ban gay marriage permanently from the Constitution right before being elected for a second term. And while I personally didn't really care all that much about that and told people that we should be focusing on stopping the Iraq War, it seemed like a whole lot of the gay community was obsessed with that specific detail of marriage equality. And then, after gays wouldn't shut up about it, Bush was reelected, which was a crying shame because even conservatives now admit that he was a certifiably awful president. I remember being angry about it, obviously. I felt at the time that my community was being selfish by making such a big deal out of gay marriage. Jon Stewart said on The Daily Show after the election that he felt like it seemed like a lot of people just couldn't get past the idea of dudes kissing. Similarly, many commentators talked about homophobia, particularly against gay men, as if it was the last socially acceptable form of discrimination. And while trans discrimination was definitely still big and rarely even talked about at all, there was a lot of truth to the idea that, homophobia against gay men was really still acceptable. It was okay to pick on us for a long time during the Bush years. But things changed. Slowly but surely. It wasn't as quick as even I remember. Feminists act like gay men haven't been oppressed for years, but Obama didn't even openly support gay marriage until 2012, actually. Though I would say the greater portion of the American political left had supported it for a while. Regardless, in the late 2000s, I remember queer being the type of crowd that I identified with the most. It had the overwhelmingly inclusive vibe about it in the way that it accepted all types of people. Granted, it was largely a bunch of what we would have called hipsters at the time, with a bit of punk or DIY vibe about them, very counterculture and into throwing house shows and underground dance parties, but still, it was the type of vibe where if you wanted to be a part of it, people would welcome you in as long as you kind of dressed right. Nobody was attacked for their identities, and we had a fun time for years. It was better than being around straight hipsters, and better than being around all gay male crowd, which often tend to have rather dull music and stuff and be sort of sex obsessed, instead of actually caring about art. However, at a certain point, membership requirements for the queer demographic started to tighten up. See, after a while, a lot of heterosexuals began hanging around the queer crowd, and it annoyed some people. Some straight people were identifying now as queer just to be cool, and people talked about that a lot. After a while, it seemed less about sexuality or gender, and more of an identity for people with a certain type of radical politics and countercultural vibe. At this point, certain people began bickering with each other, and being a bit more exclusive. More and more gatekeeping and safe spaces started to happen. Rules began where straight people were officially not welcome. Then, around the time that the Black Lives Matter movement began to break out, further lines were drawn. More and more queer events began focusing on being catered to queer people of color, instead of simply being queer. And remember, almost all Black Lives Matter supporters are also feminists. Furthermore, trans and genderqueer people began being glorified and tokenized within the community, and treated like they were extra queer and more important. The progressive stack of victimhood starting to show itself. This seemed okay for a while, as the queer scene was so popular that the events were crowded and often full of straight people. So sometimes, it sort of seemed reasonable to try to get rid of some of them, just because it was crowded. Imagine this scenario. Two friends helped throw a party at, their underground loft. Person number one. Wow, this party is full. It's almost getting out of hand. I'm still having fun. I just wish all these straight dude bros weren't here. Tell me about it. I mean, Kyle is cool, but some of his friends really don't seem to understand anything about queer politics. They keep misgendering everybody. Next time, let's just put on the invitation that no straight people are allowed. For a while, all sorts of gay men were still involved in the scene, but more and more retreated as identity politic driven fourth wave intersectional feminism began to be the primary focus of how these people socialized. Perhaps after those people in the scenario I described banned straight people from their parties, they noticed that a lot of gay guys were misgendering people too, because misgendering is pretty common in queer scenes because a lot of people have ambiguous genders. So maybe they began focusing their frustrations on gay men once the straight people were weeded out. I know I certainly saw a lot of hatred towards gay men over the past few years, certainly lots of animosity towards white gay men. And it wasn't simply how they organized their events, which commonly did deliberately book women, trans people, and people of color to DJ and perform as a priority above white gay men. Rather, a lot of it had to do with blogs and feminist literature saying that gay men were no longer an oppressed minority anymore, or that gay white men are all racist unless they date men of color. Though keep in mind, these guys also could get accused of being racist if they did date guys who weren't white, because that would be racist sexualizing or whatever. Regardless, they were always finding reasons to pick on gay white men. And God forbid a gay white guy ever try to remind anybody that he was on the same team because of the fact that he's a gay man. He would be treated like he was ignorant for even mentioning that. People would say, well, gay men are even more misogynistic than straight men. Or, just because you're gay doesn't mean you aren't racist and privileged. It legitimately seemed for a while that with every month there were more and more rules. If you were a gay man that did not want to have sex with trans men, for example, that made you less queer to people. So after a certain point, the only thing that gay men could do to be considered part of the in crowd in queer culture was to constantly virtue signal that they were queer and not assimilationist gay. And who defined queer? Generally, it became feminist blogs and the feminists who began monopolizing LGBT spaces and organizations. After a while, it seemed like there were only two types of LGBT publications online. Gay male ones that only focused on stories about celebrities, sexy men, and the occasional news story about homophobia, and the queer blogs, which were feminist and demonized masculinity. There was no middle ground anymore. So, of course, then more and more feminists started gravitating towards supposedly queer spaces and taking them over. Often these were white women who claimed to be genderqueer or non-binary, but are definitely just trans trenders who are using the status for queer points. Many of them don't even really seem to be lesbians, they were just straight girls, and somehow they are now thought of as more queer than gay men. Which, if you think about where this started, at a place where gay men were well accepted to be the last group that it is still socially acceptable to pick on back, in the 2000s, it really just boggles the mind. I had enough of all this personally when women began taking over certain specific spaces that were intended initially to be male only when they were founded in the 90s or 80s. Once a woman began attacking me for my male privilege in a space designed to be a safe space for men, I knew there was a huge problem. When I complained about it to the people in charge, one of which happened to be a woman for whatever reason, she told me that my complaint wasn't valid, that I didn't understand intersectionality well enough, and it was perfectly acceptable for me to be attacked by women in a space designated to be safe for gay men, because women are universally oppressed more than men, even though I was a gay man and the girl attacking me seemed to be straight. I think that this is all easily traceable back to fourth wave intersectional feminism. Every bit of that philosophy disenfranchises gay men, unless sometimes if you are tokenized as a gay man of color, which isn't all that fulfilling either, as my friend Tay gets into in a prior video on this channel. Regardless, I feel queer culture is damaging the homosexual male demographic as a whole at this point in time because intersectional feminism lies about men, It overemphasizes a twisted and inaccurate version of patriarchy theory to describe absolutely every facet of reality. And current feminists even do this weird thing where some women and trans men just seem kind of butthurt that they can't have sex with gay men, so they try to use queer theory as a way of guilting us into sexual experimentation with people who have vaginas, even if we aren't completely comfortable with it. But that's a subject for another video. Anyhow, have you had similar experiences? Do you feel like in order to be considered queer, you now have to be a feminist? Let me know in the comments, like this video, and subscribe if you want more. Thanks.